In the summer of 2010, a seemingly normal group of neighbors was quietly living their lives in the suburbs of New Jersey, Boston, and Virginia. They had cookouts. They took their kids to school. Some worked in finance. Some claimed to be real estate agents. Others posed as students or homemakers. They looked like any other American family, but none of them were who they said they were. Behind the picket fences and grocery store smiles were 10 deep-cover Russian agents, members of a covert operation run by the SVR, Russia's foreign intelligence service. Their mission? To embed themselves in American society, get close to key political, academic, and economic figures, and report everything back to Moscow. It was called the Illegals Program. And for over a decade, it had gone undetected, until one day it didn't. FBI Special Agent Michael Rockford remembers the moment they realized what they were looking at. We weren't dealing with amateurs, he says. These people were trained, disciplined, and knew exactly how to live under the radar. You don't just stumble across something like this. You build a case. Slowly, quietly. Then you move. The FBI had been watching some of these individuals for years. Operation Ghost Stories, as it came to be known inside the Bureau, was one of the most sensitive counterintelligence operations in modern U.S. history. It began with whispers, an intercepted message here, a mysterious coded transmission there, a couple who paid cash for everything, a man whose backstory fell apart under light scrutiny. But no single thread was enough to pull the whole thing loose. The key to understanding how these operatives worked, Agent Sarah Kemp explains, is that they didn't do anything flashy. That was the point. They were ghosts. They blended in perfectly. These weren't traditional spies sneaking into military bases or stealing documents from filing cabinets. They were deep-cover agents, illegals, trained to live as Americans, raise families, own homes, pay taxes, all while quietly feeding information to handlers through encrypted messages, dead drops, and invisible ink. We started to realize how embedded they were when one of them, a woman in New York, used a laptop to send short-range bursts of data to a passing van. Kemp says she didn't even leave her house. The van didn't stop. That was the handoff. It was espionage for the 21st century. Among the agents was a charismatic red-haired woman named Anna Chapman. She lived in Manhattan, had a popular Facebook page, and frequented high-end bars. People thought she was a rising entrepreneur. In reality, she was part of the spy ring that stretched across the country. Anna was the one who got all the press, Rockford admits. But she was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The Bureau knew it couldn't act until it had the full picture. So agents kept watching, recording, waiting. Some of the suspects had been in the U.S. for years, even decades. They had American-born children, mortgages, dog-walking routines. But behind closed doors, they decoded radio transmissions, met with handlers in parks, and practiced their cover stories until they became muscle memory. The Bureau grew more confident that this wasn't just a fluke or a few scattered individuals. This was a coordinated network, and it was active. They weren't stealing secrets in the way people imagine. Agent Kemp says it was more subtle. It was about proximity, influence, being close enough to power to report on trends, decisions, and people. The FBI faced a dilemma. The longer they watched, the more they risked these spies disappearing. But if they acted too soon, they might not have enough evidence to prove their case. So they waited just a little longer. And then came the break. A coded message intercepted between two operatives indicated that a secret meeting was being planned. A handler was coming from Moscow. The FBI had to move. 10 people, 10 homes. One night, it would become the largest U.S. spy bust since the Cold War. That night, we knocked on doors that looked just like yours or mine, Rockford recalls. But we weren't arresting Americans. We were unmasking ghosts. It was just after midnight on June 27, 2010, when coordinated FBI teams moved into position. 10 suspects, multiple states, years of surveillance coming down to a single moment. Each arrest was executed with precision. We didn't want chaos. We didn't want headlines. We wanted control, said Special Agent James McCarthy, who led one of the New York operations. Some of these people had kids. Some had neighbors who thought they were family friends. We had to move clean. In Montclair, New Jersey, agents approached a modest house with a small porch and a tidy lawn. Inside lived Richard and Cynthia Murphy, or so the neighborhood thought. Their real names were Vladimir and Lydia Guriev. They blended in perfectly, said one neighbor, interviewed years later. We had no idea. They were at every school event, always friendly. The Gurievs had spent over a decade living in the U.S., raising two daughters who were American citizens. They worked office jobs, paid their taxes, but hidden inside their home was a cache of false documents, coded notebooks, and communications gear that painted a very different picture. In Yonkers, agents knocked on the door of a quiet, middle-aged couple. Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley had been living in the U.S. for nearly 20 years. Their real names? Andrei Bazrukov and Elena Vavilova. Both were trained operatives sent from Moscow Center. Their two sons were born in Canada and had no idea their parents were Russian spies. That one was hard, Agent Kemp recalled. The kids were completely innocent. They didn't even speak Russian. Down in Arlington, Virginia, another man was taken into custody. Mikhail Semenko, young, ambitious, and fluent in Mandarin, he had no family. His cover was that of a young international businessman. In truth, he had received specialized espionage training in Russia before being sent to the U.S. And in Manhattan, FBI agents closed in on the woman who had become the face of the operation, Anna Chapman. She didn't resist. She knew the game was up, said Agent Rockford. She was calm, collected, almost too calm, like she'd been trained for this. Chapman had recently made a mistake. She had attempted to communicate with a Russian official at a New York coffee shop using a laptop and a short-range wireless network. The FBI had intercepted the signal and tracked her movements. Worse, when agents confronted her days earlier and tried to recruit her as a double agent, she'd panicked and contacted her handler. That one misstep forced the Bureau to accelerate its plans. Within 24 hours, all 10 individuals were in federal custody. We brought them in quietly, said McCarthy. There were no mugshots in the paper, no press conferences. We wanted to minimize damage, not cause a diplomatic firestorm. Behind closed doors, the suspects were processed, separated, and questioned. But the FBI already knew they wouldn't be facing long prison terms. They had something else in mind. From the beginning, we knew this was about leverage, said former CIA analyst Mark Driscoll. These people weren't just going to prison. They were going home, but on our terms. While the public remained largely in the dark, the intelligence community was already preparing for one of the largest spy swaps since the height of the Cold War. But first, the FBI needed to connect the dots and confirm to the world that these people weren't just pretending. They were Russian operatives, and they had been living among us for years. It wasn't just about what they did, said Kemp. It was about what they were capable of. Their mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. Until we stopped it. Inside a secure federal facility, 10 suspects sat in separate rooms under tight watch. There were no dramatic outbursts. No denial screamed across the table. Just silence, followed by controlled answers, measured glances, and the kind of body language that only seasoned counterintelligence agents could read. These weren't nervous people, said FBI interrogator Tom Ellison. They were calm, practiced. Some were even polite. You could tell they had been trained for this moment, or at least something like it. The FBI already had enough evidence to bring formal charges. Secret radio messages, encrypted communications, hidden laptops, and evidence of financial support from Moscow. But now came the next challenge, verifying identities. Most of the names on the IDs were fabricated, fake birth certificates, invented backgrounds, stolen or forged documentation. But behind each alias was a real person, carefully prepared for a life of deep cover espionage. They weren't your typical spies, said Special Agent Kemp. They weren't breaking into military facilities. Their strength was access, social access. The Bureau discovered that the agents had been slowly and deliberately trying to position themselves near think tanks, university professors, former diplomats, and government consultants. They didn't need to steal classified documents. They just needed to hear the conversations that shaped U.S. foreign policy. One suspect, operating as Richard Murphy, had even pursued contacts within a former high-ranking official's inner circle. Another posed as an international finance expert and had begun forming relationships with economists who consulted for government agencies. It was subtle. It was patient. And that's what made it dangerous, said retired CIA officer Claire Naylor. They were waiting for opportunity, not creating it. That's much harder to detect. Anna Chapman stood out among them. During questioning, agents noted her unusual poise and her refusal to say anything that might compromise her network. She asked for a lawyer. She said little, but her digital footprint said more than enough. Her laptop contained traces of messages sent through short-range networks, a method of communication rarely seen in traditional espionage. Investigators also recovered photos, financial records, and transcript of intercepted messages, confirming she had received direct instructions from SVR handlers. Her biggest weakness wasn't her behavior. It was her tech, Agent Ellison said. She didn't realize how much we'd already seen. Meanwhile, another agent, Juan Lazaro, who had lived in Yonkers, made a quiet but critical admission during questioning. When pushed, he finally said, "My name isn't Juan Lazaro. I'm not from Uruguay. That's not my real identity." But he wouldn't say his true name, not even when threatened with prison. He said he would rather betray his country than betray Russia, one agent recalled. And that told us everything. It became clear that most of the suspects were what intelligence professionals called sleeper agents. They had arrived in the U.S. years earlier, some in the 1990s, and were planted with one goal: to blend in and wait for orders. Their operations were low profile by design. No bombs, no briefcases of cash exchanged in alleys. This was long-game espionage, and the United States had walked right into it. Still, despite the FBI's mountain of evidence, charging them as spies wasn't straightforward. Technically, none of the operatives had yet stolen state secrets or committed violent acts. Instead, they were indicted for acting as unregistered agents of a foreign government and money laundering, charges that carried prison time, but not the weight of classic espionage. It wasn't about throwing them in jail forever, said U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara at the time. It was about stopping their mission before it went any further. Privately, the U.S. government began to explore another route, a high-level spy exchange that could both solve the case and provide diplomatic value. What followed was a series of quiet phone calls, encrypted back-channel negotiations, and international coordination between Washington and Moscow. 10 spies, 4-4. It was like something out of a Cold War movie, said a State Department official. Only this was real, and it was happening now. As plans for the exchange came together, the U.S. prepared to send its prisoners home. But before they could board the plane, each operative was asked to confirm, one last time, who they truly were. Some gave only code names. Others admitted their Russian identities. But nothing more. None showed remorse. They had lived as Americans. Some even loved their lives here. But when the curtain fell, they all chose to go back to the country that trained them. As the final interrogations wrapped and the press caught wind of something unusual happening behind the scenes, the United States government moved quickly. Discussions that had been taking place through diplomatic channels were now formalizing into a historic deal. The FBI, the Department of Justice, and the State Department were all involved. But the most delicate part was handled through intelligence-to-intelligence negotiation, a world rarely seen by the public. This wasn't something you could announce, said one former intelligence official involved in the process. We weren't just trading bodies. We were trading secrets, loyalties, and years of national interest. On July 8, 2010, just 11 days after the arrests, a plane took off from New York, carrying the 10 Russian agents who had lived for years in American neighborhoods. Destination, Vienna, Austria. At the same time, a second plane arrived in Vienna from Moscow. On board were 4 men imprisoned in Russia for allegedly spying on behalf of Western intelligence agencies. These were not unknown names in the intelligence world. They were high-value assets, men who had spent years in Russian prisons under suspicion of treason. Among them was Sergei Skripal, a former GRU officer convicted in 2006 of passing Russian military secrets to MI6. Another was Igor Satyagin, a respected arms control researcher accused of espionage. Though he had always denied being a spy, his case had drawn criticism for its lack of due process. "It wasn't equal," said one retired CIA analyst. "We gave back 10 who had never been charged with espionage, and we got 4 who had been punished harshly for helping us. But morally, strategically, we got the better end." The swap took place at Schwechat International Airport. No crowds, no cameras, just 2 planes parked near each other on the tarmac, shielded from public view. FBI agents escorted the 10 individuals down the stairs of the U.S. aircraft and handed them over to Russian officials. Simultaneously, U.S. personnel greeted the 4 men coming from the opposite direction. It was quick, professional, like a high-stakes business transaction, just with national security on the line. One U.S. official said. Anna Chapman, dressed in jeans and a dark coat, was quiet. So were the others. Some looked relieved. A few looked back at the American agents before boarding the Russian plane, but none resisted. None asked to stay. That was the hardest part, one FBI agent admitted later. Watching them walk away, knowing they had lived here, raised families here, and chose to disappear back into that world. By the time the planes left Austrian airspace, the headlines were everywhere. Spy swap between U.S. and Russia completed. Anna Chapman and 9 others returned to Moscow. Cold War drama in the 21st century. For many, the story was sensational. Anna Chapman quickly became a media obsession in Russia, giving interviews, appearing in magazine shoots, and even landing a role on television. She was transformed from a quiet operative into a pop culture figure. "It was surreal," said journalist Alexei Petrov. One week, she's a secret agent. The next, she's on the cover of glossy magazines. Russia knew how to spin the story. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the returned prisoners were quietly debriefed. The CIA and MI6 conducted long interviews with their freed assets, eager to extract every remaining detail from their time in Russian custody. The public would only learn fragments of what was traded. "Spy swaps aren't just symbolic," said intelligence historian Claire Naylor. "They're tactical. You bring people home, you signal strength, and you send a message. We're always watching." But questions remained. How many other illegals were still out there? How many had never been caught? For the FBI, Operation Ghost Stories was a major success, but also a wake-up call. These 10 weren't the only ones, said Special Agent Rockford. They were just the ones we found. That's the part that should keep people up at night. Back in Moscow, the 10 returned agents were treated not as criminals, but as patriots. Official footage released days later showed the group seated formally at a long table inside a government building, being addressed directly by then-President Dmitry Medvedev. He awarded several of them the prestigious Order of Courage, one of Russia's highest state honors. They had lived for years in enemy territory, the state declared. They had risked everything. Now they were home. It was clear Russia wanted to send a message, said Russian intelligence analyst Maria Leonova. These weren't just spies. They were heroes in the narrative being built. But behind the public ceremony, things weren't so simple. According to reports leaked years later, several of the agents were quietly sidelined. Some were given desk jobs within the SVR. Others were advised to avoid public life. 1 or 2 reportedly moved out of Russia altogether, choosing lives of quiet obscurity elsewhere in Europe. Only Anna Chapman embraced the spotlight. Within weeks, she had launched a modeling career, appeared on Russian talk shows, hosted a TV program about mysteries and conspiracies, and even became a minor political figure within the young guard of United Russia. She posted selfies. She flirted with fame. It felt like a surreal second life, said a former colleague. She went from spy to celebrity almost overnight. Her Instagram presence became as widely followed as her case file had once been in the U.S. media. But not everyone in the intelligence world was impressed. She broke the first rule, said former CIA officer Jack Devine. A spy's value is in staying invisible. When you become a brand, you become useless. Meanwhile, the personal cost of the case began to surface, especially for the children of the illegals left behind in the U.S. The 2 daughters of Richard and Cynthia Murphy, born and raised in New Jersey, were suddenly taken from everything they knew. Reportedly, they were placed into Russian schools and faced language barriers, cultural shock, and intense media scrutiny. They were innocent, said Special Agent Kemp. Just American kids. And then one day, their entire world was ripped out from under them. The sons of Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley, both born in Canada, spoke out years later. One of them, Tim Foley, gave interviews describing the trauma of discovering that his parents weren't who they claimed to be. "I felt like I'd lost my identity," he said. "It wasn't just that my parents were spies. It was that everything I believed about myself had been a lie." As the personal stories slowly surfaced, so did the policy shifts. Inside the FBI, Operation Ghost Stories became a template for handling long-term counterintelligence threats. Surveillance techniques were reviewed. Analyst training was updated. Communication intercept programs were expanded. "We realized we had underestimated the depth of some foreign operations," said a senior FBI official. This was a new kind of spy, not the Cold War caricature, but the neighbor next door. It also changed how the U.S. handled foreign nationals working in sensitive sectors. More background checks, more visa scrutiny, more joint operations with CIA and Homeland Security. At the same time, American intelligence officers began to worry about perception. If 10 spies had lived undetected for so long, what did that say about national security? There was embarrassment, admitted former National Security Advisor Thomas Edison. This wasn't some old-school wiretap. This was years of full immersion, unnoticed. It hurt. Even allies of the U.S. began reviewing their own internal protocols, wondering if similar ghost agents might be operating inside their borders. The world of espionage didn't die after the Cold War, said British intelligence historian Catherine Marsh. It just changed its clothes and moved into your neighborhood. Years have passed since 10 Russian agents were plucked from their quiet suburban lives and flown across the ocean in silence. Yet, for those who investigated them, and for those who lived beside them, the shadows remain. "We don't look at neighborhoods the same way anymore," said Special Agent Michael Rockford, who supervised parts of the investigation. These weren't people sneaking in the dark. They were cooking burgers in the yard, playing soccer with their kids. The deception was total. That realization didn't just haunt investigators. It rewrote the way the U.S. approached counterintelligence. Today, American security agencies monitor not only classified facilities, but also the everyday digital landscape. Suspicious financial transactions, unusual data patterns, foreign language usage in unusual geographic regions. The line between cybersecurity and human intelligence has blurred. You no longer need a trench coat and a dead drop to be a spy, said former CIA officer Carla Martinez. You just need Wi-Fi and time. The Illegals program was, in many ways, a reminder that espionage had never disappeared. It had simply evolved. The idea of sleeper agents had long existed in spy novels and Cold War legends. But 2010 made it real again, tangible, alarming. It woke us up, Martinez continued. We realized we had gotten too comfortable. We thought espionage was dramatic. This proved it could be boring, and that's what made it deadly. Though no evidence surfaced that the 10 agents passed classified materials, the intent was clear: influence, access, positioning, and the next wave of spies would likely learn from their mistakes. Russia, too, evolved after the swap. Intelligence agencies grew more technologically agile. Cyber warfare and online disinformation would become Moscow's signature in the decade come, a transition some say began after the public collapse of the Illegals program. When human assets get exposed, said cyber intelligence expert Eric Dalton, the logical move is to go digital. It's cheaper, faster, and harder to trace. Still, some in the intelligence community believe the use of deep cover operatives never truly ended. In fact, some worry it has expanded. You think there aren't more out there? Said an unnamed U.S. intelligence official. You're not paying attention. And what about the people who lived alongside the spies? Some neighbors still recall the shock. Others say they feel deceived. But many simply moved on, the same way people move on from the strange, the tragic, the unexplainable. It was like a movie, one Montclair resident said. Only real, and it happened right here. In the end, Operation Ghost Stories wasn't just a counterintelligence win. It was a moment of reckoning. It revealed that espionage is no longer confined to war zones or high-security corridors. It exists in city apartments and suburban cul-de-sacs. It wears a smile, mows the lawn, and files taxes on time. And when it's caught, it disappears just as quietly. "We don't always get to slam the door shut," said Agent Kemp. "Sometimes we just see the outline, the shape of something hiding in plain sight, and then it's gone." In 2010, the FBI pulled back the curtain. They showed the world what a modern spy really looks like. But the scariest part? They were already living here.